What can American entrepreneurs learn from Egyptian entrepreneurs? Find out on today's episode of the Freedom Club Podcast.
Welcome to the Freedom Club Podcast, where we discover the fight for freedom, fulfillment, passion, and purpose. Your host is Curt Gallup certified strengths coach, an agency founder who is dedicated to coaching individuals seeking to level up their life and their businesses. The Freedom Club is about unlocking your talents, turning them into strengths, and crushing your objectives. You can learn more at curtmercadante.com. Welcome to the Freedom Club.
And happy Wednesday, everybody. This is the Freedom Club Podcast. I am your cruise director, Curt Mercadante, and I am so happy you are here. Whether this is your first time listening or your 101st time listening, you complete me. Seriously, though, you help me fulfill my mission of saving the world by helping individuals fight for freedom and fulfillment. And if you have a friend, family, colleague who you think would benefit from hearing our message, I urge you to share this podcast with them. Refer it to them. Stop by, leave us a positive rating or review on iTunes. I say it all the time, but those are like currency to us. I don't charge you a thing for this podcast. I thank you, and I'm very grateful that you're here. And if you can just tell one person about our podcast, refer it to them, I would be so appreciative. And today's podcast, we have something very special. So, as some of you know, in late September, early October, I spent a week in Cairo, Egypt, and I did a 2-day workshop at Flat 6 Labs, which is Egypt's top startup accelerator. And we talked a lot about vision, purpose, and impact. I was one of a handful of just incredible speakers they had there. And some of these startups, if they make them, I talk about it a little more in today's podcast. If they make it, they are going to change the world. I mean, there's a startup, a telemedicine startup, that's going to save lives by ensuring 24/7 access to affordable healthcare in a region that needs it the most. So, was so excited to go out to Egypt. It was a great learning experience for me. If you follow me on LinkedIn and Instagram or Facebook, you saw the pictures of me at the pyramids with the Sphinx, and so got a lot of that done. As a history buff, man, I was in heaven. But I was also in heaven engaging with those startups and helping them, even in a small way, to achieve their vision for building a life-changing company. And on today's episode, we were unable to find time to record a podcast while I was there, but in today's episode, we have Mustafa Khater. He is the managing director of Flat 6 Labs, and we have Ahmed Elsherif. He's the program director of Flat 6 Labs. Just two awesome, incredible individuals who sacrifice, who give of their days to help these startups mature and go out into the world. They all have interesting stories as well. We talk about all of that. We talk about what it's like, what the startup ecosystem is like in Egypt. And even what can American entrepreneurs learn from Egyptian entrepreneurs? So all that and more on today's episode of the Freedom Club Podcast. Here's my interview with the gurus from Flat 6 Labs in Cairo, Egypt.
Yeah.
Well, Mustafa Ahmed, thanks so much for being on the Freedom Club Podcast. And I had the opportunity to meet you both in person a few weeks ago in Cairo, and really appreciated it. And thanks for having me out.
Thank you for making the time.
Awesome.
Thank you for making us celebrities.
Yeah, right.
I mean, seriously,
yeah.
It was awesome having you over here in Egypt. I mean, the kind of value this kind of cross-pollination delivers is really amazing. It's just amazing. I'm sure we'll talk about that as well.
Yeah. And from a personal standpoint, it was a growing experience for me because I had only been to Europe and Canada and the Bahamas. But other than that, I'd never been to the African continent, never been to Egypt, never been to Cairo. And so it was a growing experience for me personally as well. And working with the entrepreneurs is always a wonderful experience because some of those startups, which we'll talk about in a little bit, once they get there and once they make it, they're going to save lives and change the world, which is really, really amazing. So the first question I always ask all my guests, unless I forget to ask it, and then it's the second or third question is, and I'll pose it to both of you, but what does the word freedom mean to you?
I would say that freedom for me means that that you're working on what you on what you love, while completely being yourself shamelessly, and continuously fighting for what you really believe in, combining the three angles together. I think you'd be a continuously satisfied person.
Cool. Mustafa?
I think that's my definition.
Well,
Thank you.
It's kind of like it's a very cool question. Yeah. I mean, if I reflect on that question, I would say, how does free feel to me? And I cannot escape the concept of the team in that. For me, freedom means a certain kind of like a galloping, sort of like a pride of horses, like going along with a certain speed, and they're kind of like enjoying that. There's pride and freedom. There's maneuverability. There's speed. There are a lot of attributes to freedom to me, and but most of them that resonates with me is the team. It's kind of like the culture that the team can reach up to in order to be able to dance. And when those teams are really dancing with a certain pattern, with a certain galloping, so to say, feels like kind of like the migration times of all those buffaloes and a certain in the prides. And I cannot escape this mental image, to be honest. I think this represents really freedom to me, this kind of run, but with other people. It's kind of like not a lone run. It's kind of like a run with your bunch, with your sort of like your support circle, and where everybody supports each other, but this conglomeration of organisms creates something that is bigger. That's freedom to me.
I would actually as well combine what I said and what Mustafa said together by saying that I would say it's a heightened sense of alignment. Which I would say that if you're fighting and for what you believe in continuously, and driving impact, working on what you believe in, working on what you love, being yourself shamelessly, and actually doing this through linking with people who are actually subscribing to this and who are open to accommodating this, then there's no. I don't think there's anything better than that, or anything beyond that level of freedom. I don't. I think that this is the best way to define it.
Thank you. And Mustafa, you mentioned the migration of buffalo and moving in the direction, and I immediately started thinking of Cairo traffic, automobile traffic.
Yes, of course.
And one thing that was interesting, we were at dinner a few weeks ago, and you mentioned that there was a study about Cairo traffic. I think you said some Japanese researchers did a study on it and said that they found that there's no scientific way that traffic should actually move, yet everyone there finds a way to do it. It's amazing to me, because to me it was about more than just traffic, and I think that's the point you were trying to make. It was about Egyptians, and there's no way they should do some of the things that you do, yet you find a way.
Yeah, like when you create a study based on certain criteria, you make certain assumptions. So you would assume that the distance between two cars that is safe to drive and that is not taking any risks would be, I don't know, 6 feet maybe. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the standard is. But assumingly, when a nation is sort of like condensed into not being able to cope with the standards and still have a flow of traffic at the same time, you see that the people naturally, they would compromise on those standards, yet still they will take risks. And this is actually what entrepreneurs do. I mean, they're trying to get out of their boxes, and there's no way to get out of the box without having risk at the game. Of course, I'm not promoting any kind of like health hazards here, or kind of like do something stupid in order to kind of like get traffic to flow. But when everybody is under that pressure and they start taking risks together, there's a flow with this kind of risk taking that is natural to a sort of like similar, again, like a buffalo migration kind of thing. They rub each other's shoulders. Sometimes somebody trips, something bad happens along that journey, but the flow is there. It's migration time. Nothing can stop it. It's beyond human. It's really the response of a conglomerate of humans to a certain type of pressure, and that's the sort of like the collective genius that is acting based on the current circumstances that's been given as an input.
That's awesome. And you know, Flat Six Labs, obviously as a startup accelerator, you work with people who are taking risks. You of course help put together a process and some investment and capital, et cetera, to help, right, lessen the risk for them, or at least even it out a little bit so they can be more successful. Tell me a little bit about Flat Six Labs, how it was started. I know you have locations not just in Cairo, but now in you know, around the world. What was the impetus behind starting it? And because it started, are you 7 years old at this point?
Yeah, 7 years old.
So that started at an interesting time in Cairo. A lot of interesting things were going on right around that time in Egypt.
Yeah. Yes, a lot of stuff was happening there. Ahmed, would you want to go take the shot at this? You've been there more than I was.
Well, to simplify it, Flat Six Labs started in response to an opportunity in creating value through entrepreneurship in the Egyptian market. At that point in time, it was post the revolution, and it wasn't in response to the revolution or the positive momentum that the revolution has built, but it came at a time where there was a movement that was being initiated towards building an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So, and at this point in time, it was an opportunity as well to bridge the gap between startups that are very young, who need we need serious education and enablement, and venture capital firms that needed to invest big ticket sums in startups that have proven the growth and traction in the market. So this is how Flat Six Labs was born, and it was born to become an early stage venture capital and acceleration vehicle that can house startups in the early stage and take them through an accelerated process of growth and scale in a very challenging market that is under-resourced, so that by the time they graduate from the accelerator, they have been converted into businesses that can acquire investment. And this is how Flat Six Labs was founded, basically founded on that principle, which is basically the principle of accelerating entrepreneurship and creating more startups, creating more for the purpose of creating more jobs, and for the purpose of contributing to a better and bigger economy, and disrupting markets through innovative products in the digital space and tech space.
Wonderful. And from a personal standpoint, how did you two end up there? What journey brought you there from wherever you were before there?
Sorry, internet connection is a bit unstable on my end.
Sorry. Yeah, I know. I asked from a personal standpoint, what brought each of you to Flat Six Labs?
What
brought each of you to Flat Six Labs? Where were you at before Flat Six Labs? Why did you join?
I think Mustafa can lead first with that, and then.
I started off my career as an architect. It was something I was passionate about. I was always a very visual person, and yet still sort of like the artists and engineers. They usually get an entrance point into the world of commerce and business once the technical piece of their career is kind of like seems to be a natural ending. I kind of like captured this rather early during my career, and I decided to jump out from an entrepreneurship experience that I had. So I had built a convoy architects and planners, and we had built and scaled around 180 schools in Egypt. But then I had a change of heart, and I kind of like started disbelieving in entrepreneurship, and I started disbelieving in the general sentiment of appreciation of art and design. And so I did not see that my customer segment, or the wide range of customer segments in Cairo, would actually yield any kind of profitability for me on the longer stage. And so I decided that I'm gonna go and have to roughen up and take the life of an employee, and went to work for Shell, where I was promised kind of like a fast track and also a differentiated type of journey. So I wanted to learn from such a beast, and after like 12 years being with Shell, this is like quite a long time. I felt kind of like, oh, this is sort of like being single branded with a multinational stamp on you. This could definitely sort of like, from a career perspective, from a ladder jumping perspective, and kind of like the corporate race doesn't look so good. So I'm kind of like losing both ends. I'm like losing the entrepreneurship end, and I'm also losing the corporate end. So I'm not finding a place that hosts the sort of like experience that I'm gathering. So always having the ambition to drive for holism, and sort of like being a sort of like a polymath wannabe, striving to be a real polymath, like the various examples that you could see in history, where in ancient times you can have the philosopher, the strategist, you can also have the handyman, and the guy who has a lot of sense for detail still, and people who can cover this kind of spectrum. So I think this is my continuous improvement journey. And when I was like sort of like threatened with like being single branded, this is where I started like going for like an MBA. I'm 40-year-old guy, and I decided to go to a good school at INSEAD in France, and I had a very nice trip around the world, like which took me also to San Francisco, and there I really saw the kind of merger between tech, art, and the scene around the kind of like engineering and business and commerce and the venture capital, and then the corporate venture capital. Sort of like San Francisco brings it all together in a sense as first try. But I thought to myself, not everything needs to be like San Francisco. And this is where sort of like the national sentiment kicks in. I came back to Egypt, where it was kind of like good time after having decided to leave Shell after 12 years with them, to kind of like start engaging with the entrepreneurship space and start building something for myself. But at the end of the road, I found Flat Six Labs really being very much open arms to accept the kind of talent in the market, and nurture it with a lot of knowledge around such an establishment. So this is where Flat Six Labs and my career came to merge, and to take a differentiated journey in sort of like redesigning the boot camps, and redesigning also the programs with Ahmed. So this year we've done a lot of change. We've undergone a lot of change around the entrepreneurship space, and how we also speak to the public, and how we engage the entrepreneurs with regards to differentiated activities that Ahmed and I have designed together, along also with our community manager, Sarah Abdelazim. So I think this is sort of like kind of like what brings me to Flat Six Labs, how this came to happen.
Uh-oh. He froze.
Yeah.
Well, I can edit that out.
Like an issue, you know?
Oh, you froze there for a little bit.
Yeah, phone calls still take over voice over IP. I think this is discrimination. I think, seriously, they should have the option by the telecoms to prohibit phones from coming in when you like have
Oh, that's what happened. You were getting a call. Got it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, hey, this is not democratic at all.
Yeah, I think it's the most annoying thing.
Anyhow,
seriously.
So yeah, this is sort of how I saw Flat Six Labs and how we started the journey together.
Cool. How about you, Ahmed?
I completely detested, and I'm completely detested what I studied back in university. I studied pharmacy and biotech.
Huh.
So I was essentially a trained process engineer somehow by some form of statistic education. And I did not enjoy what I studied. And this is a very important cornerstone of my personality. I am to the core a lost personality. I am always in search for what makes sense to me the most. So I've always been a very analytical person by observation, not by data. And I've always had a taste for designing interventions that can solve problems, that can solve serious problems. I always like to spot what problems are and where the deficiency in the system is that is surrounding me, whether from the social angle or from the innovation angle. And I've always had a level of openness towards doing things differently. And on top of that, I've always been a very partnership-driven person as well. I enjoy working with people who and discovering new ways of doing things and creating and co-creating value. And so I've never had a fear of the unknown. I've always enjoyed uncertainty, but with a sense of direction. So for someone who studied pharmacy and biotech, this did not really work. This field did not really work for me, and it confines you, and it doesn't really open doors. It doesn't really activate a sense of exploration. So when I graduated from university, I decided that there's one thing in life that I know, which is that I do not want to do this. And and everything else was a mystery to me. And most probably until today, things are a bit mysterious. But at least I know now that I have a passion for design-led work. I have even a stronger passion for music. And last but not least, I have a passion as well for joining for strategic partnerships. And by strategic partnerships, I mean whether it's in friendships or in professional contexts. I enjoy. I always visualize it like I would always at some point in time I would love to be doing what I love with a team of Avenger-like badasses who lead a good life together. And since I graduated from university, I started doing entrepreneurially driven work. For a while, I worked with an international exchange and leadership and youth leadership development organization called ISEC. I've done a lot of expansion-related work with them. I used to wear the hat of the expansion of the strategic expansion director, who ventures into places where ISEC did not, where ISEC entities did not exist, and basically start them and build them up and drive them from the ground up, build them from scratch. So one of the angles that I would add to my personality as well as strategic thinking and setting direction. So I've done a lot of work back then in expanding the capacity of the organization and establishing newly incepted ISEC entities. And back then, I did not know anything about the concepts of a startup ecosystem, or what an accelerator is, or what are the needs of an entrepreneur. And after I finished ISEC, I jumped on to do more consulting work, where I've done a lot of consulting in leadership development, training, and organizational change locally in the Egyptian market, doing a lot of business development and enterprise partnerships. I got fed up of the line of work because it involves a lot of preaching and not practicing and working. And I had to do a lot of work with a lot of business to business work with multinational companies and Egyptian corporations. So this is when I realized that I need to combine what I've done previously with what I like, with my so-called brain power, and do more work that is flexible. And where is this flexibility? Flexibility lies in entrepreneurial work. Where can I do entrepreneurial work? And this is when I started spotting different organizations like Rise Up, Flat Six Labs, and their activities. And this is when I realized. I decided to break into what they call the entrepreneurship ecosystem. So I only had my wits and grits and my brain power and my taste for discovering what this is all about, and took a deep dive into the market and started networking and building relationships with a set of entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship support organizations, and running pilot engagements with key ecosystem entities. So I ended up interviewing over 100 entrepreneurs to really and basically my interviews were mainly revolving around understanding their needs, what their challenges are, how do they view the entrepreneurship ecosystem and its support infrastructure. Worked with a couple of organizations like Rise Up and co-working spaces where I partnered with them on developing better agendas and running better entrepreneurship development processes, and consulted a couple of startups on their models and on their business models and how can they better bring products to market, until I realized that it's not working. There was no product market fit. I was selling the wrong product. I was selling the wrong product to the wrong customers. So it was a total failure. But it generated a high volume of learning. I acquired a lot of knowledge, a lot of on-ground knowledge. It's what I like to say, word on the street. So I understood what's happening on the street.
Sure.
And this is when I found myself getting attracted to Flat Six Labs. I applied for the program manager role and to join Flat Six Labs. And this is basically how my philosophy suddenly evolved. And this is the kind of philosophy that I live by now, which is, if you want to change something, if you really want to drive the right level of change, if you want to add value to an existing ecosystem or an existing market or an existing society, you need to be part of it. You need to understand. You need to live through it, and you need to go through its pain. You need to go through its pros. You need to go through its cons. You need to suffer from its drawbacks until you are seriously ready to dictate something different.
Sure.
And since then, this is what I've been doing.
So how many? Thanks for that, both of you. How many entrepreneurs have over the past 7 years come through the program? How many startups?
81 so far.
81.
So 81 out of Cairo only, but over 140 across the MENA region.
Got it.
Over the past 7 years, even the ones up to the 140, like the other 70 across the MENA region, they were like roughly around only the past 4 years.
And for those who don't understand, what does the MENA region encompass?
Okay. So we have locations in several places. So we have locations in Abu Dhabi, in Saudi, in Beirut, in Tunis, in Cairo. That's our headquarters and also our first office. And last but not least, just recently, we joined in with Bahrain a few months back, and we just had our first demo day as well.
Great. So of all those startups that have come through, if you could identify the number one challenge that they face, the most common challenge, what would it be?
The most common challenge that startups face, or the most common development area?
The area where they get stuck the most when they come through the program, that hurdle that is so hard for them, where they kind of end up getting stuck in the mud, can't move forward.
Access to market. In my opinion, it's access to market, and because of two major areas of development. They don't spend enough time understanding customers and markets, and on the other end, because they don't spend enough time understanding customers and markets, they focus on the wrong priorities. So access to market becomes a nightmare.
Interesting. Is that a little bit about kind of what we talked about when they're focused on the next 5 tasks they have to do today versus what impact are they going to have on the customer?
It's a combination between productivity and focusing on the right priorities. And the second part is, do you really understand the customer and the market landscape that you're operating in, which both of them combine towards a nightmare of marketing and customer acquisition.
Got it. And I realized,
we've conducted some work there, Curt, as well, with the Innovation 360 out of Stockholm. Okay. So while Ahmed and we were like researching what kind of additional elements our curriculum may be lacking, we actually asked ourselves this question, and when we sat down with the Swedes and we started like doing a bit of a value driving exercise, we came up that we have one value that is kind of like a double-edged sword that we have here in Egypt. And you'd find that Egyptians are pretty much high on creative chaos. That's practically speaking how the Egyptian character would be identified. So funny enough, it's definitely a double-edged sword. I mean, if you go to a company like IDEO, or you go to some of the heaviest design thinkers around the block, you'd see that this kind of character is heavily appreciated because it doesn't exist a lot, the creative, chaotic guy or woman. And in that regard, I think Egypt is, you will find it like very highly ranking in that area. When we looked at Sweden, we found that one of the elements that they don't discuss a lot is structure and function. It seems that structure and function is so inherent in the Swedish stereotype, if we may like work with stereotypes just for as a cause of goods, not as a cause of anything bad. We'd see that structure and structure and that kind of focus around design and the functionality in design is very apparent in most of the Swedish products, and you can see it in the Swedish character, and you can see it in the culture. You can see it also dealing with time. You can see it with the ways of working. Now, the work that we've conducted is can we cross-pollinate those two values? Can we get a bunch of Egyptian entrepreneurs and a bunch of Swedish entrepreneurs and kind of like squash this together? And this is what you can find, for example, in one of the great up-and-coming gaming companies coming up today, like Funrock, for example. So Funrock is a merger between this Swedish functionality, design, and structure versus the creativity and in chaos that Egyptians are very much accustomed to because of the circumstances and the context. So I would say sort of like I'd conclude that the major challenge you'd find here because of our chaos is our inability to focus on who our customer is. We find many entrepreneurs who seem to not know who the customer is, and we've just had also Paul Huon coming in from INSEAD. Just last week, we've had some other sessions as well after you just left, and we figured out when we asked the entrepreneurs who the customer is, they all has this very wide, fluid version of what the customer is. And even when they get into segmentation and they start getting, okay, so 21 to 35-year-old male, yeah, it just starts sounding more like senseless data. But really sensing who the customer is, empathizing with that customer, and really knowing what the problem for that customer is at a very minute stage and drilling the details, I think there's a little bit of tiredness in the teams of entrepreneurs to continue that journey. It seems to be a tiring journey if it's not a natural one. And it depends from an ecosystem to the other, the types of entrepreneurs and how they would behave from a customer-centric perspective or from a business-centric perspective, and how they perceive business and what it is. Egypt has always been kind of like very centric towards commerce. So a lot of snap decisions, a lot of quick hits and runs. We're a very old country, 7,000 years old. And so you'd find that trade has evolved to become very fast at certain ages in history. And so it's almost like as if you're like operating in the stock market. So people tend to be generally unfocused on building the value that may take a longer time and a longer focal element than what we are used to.
It's interesting. Yeah, because business isn't just an idea or a creative thought, right? But that's where the most fun part can be, right? Coming up with this wonderful idea, designing it, the bells and the whistles, and then it's like, well, who's going to buy it?
Ta-da!
Yeah, right. I have no idea who's going to buy it. And then also to something Ahmed said, and something we talked about when we were there, it's like, people don't give a shit about your features and some of those things. Steve Jobs, when he came back to Apple, gave a now iconic speech in which he said, to bring the Apple brand back, where they were spending a ton on advertising at that point. And he said, you wouldn't even know it. because it was having no impact. And he said to bring the Apple brand back, we're not going to talk about the boxes we make with circuits in them, computers. He said, we do a great job of that. We're not going to talk about processor speeds, megahertz. We're not going to talk about how bad Windows is or how much better we are than Windows. And he came up with a more compelling vision for what they wanted to do that was about impacting the customer. Because in the end, the customer doesn't care about you. They don't care about your company. They don't care about, beyond what you can provide them. And when you can create a compelling vision for the impact that you're going to have on their lives, it's why here in the US, people go and spend a premium to shop at Whole Foods to spend more because it's organic food, right? And they feel like it's having a better impact on them. Now, it's not everyone, but Whole Foods, John Mackey, the founder, said, we're going to go for this segment of customers. We're not going to be Walmart, which is, out here. We're going to go for this segment of customers. Steve Jobs says, listen, we could sell a cheap computer and say our customer base is everyone, or we can focus on the people who are going to spend $1,000 on a phone or $2,500 on a thing. And by the way, wait out in the rain, the sleet, the snow, and the hail when we release a new phone. And so, Apple's a good way of, they combine that design and the creativity with, they know who they want to sell to, and it's not everyone.
Yeah. It's definitely not everyone, and most of the entrepreneurs come with grandiose ideas that are like so fragmented around everything. I just had a call like an hour back before this podcast, and I got these guys who were like kind of like trying to resolve like everything in the world. These are like most of the pitches that we hear, because between Ahmed and I, we get like around 2,000 to 3,000 pitches that just pass our eyes, if you divide them. So that's quite almost like a 10 pitches a day. And when you have a conference, then you have more. And then during regular days, you have like meetings with the startups and people who are coming in to provide applications to you, etc., etc. So amongst all these entrepreneurs, you see a pattern. And when we look at the patterns, you see that still like almost 50% of the startups that I see are still in the space of trying to resolve world hunger, and they haven't passed that stage yet. And unfortunately, it's you can solve world hunger if you really identify who's the hungriest in the world and go and give them food, and then step forward and then see who's second hungriest in the world and go give them food. Then if you have the data, you can actually track this down and you can actually solve world hunger, or at least reduce it, and you can have your impact on it. But you need to have a systemized way of thinking, in terms of not just being all around there, kind of like in philosophy space. And I think that many entrepreneurs get lost in their philosophy and get lost of not understanding that the market, that gaining trust of the market is something that they have to pay their contribution towards. Many people think the world owes them something, and the world doesn't owe them anything. The world doesn't owe them shit. The world owes them an opportunity.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's a very, very good point. Yeah, the world really doesn't owe them shit.
Yeah.
Their attitude is a toxic attitude. They believe just because they have an idea or they have a product that the world is that they are entitled to the world's money, the world's time, the world's effort without breaking a sweat. So yeah,
but also the ecosystem has corrupted this space a bit, because if the ecosystem is primarily built on accelerators, incubators, and VCs who are supporting the ecosystem, I think specifically for emerging economies, when you're trying to oversupply the markets with a support system, especially also with international donors, and all embassies are also involved. So everybody's really trying to pay their contribution towards the entrepreneurship ecosystem in general. But what we see happening specifically in Cairo is that now everybody graduates from college or university, and they come up and they say, oh, here's the support system. Where do I go? Hey, where do I sign up? And suddenly they start having ideas that, hey, this is the natural status quo. And they don't understand how much sweat has been put into building this ecosystem, and that everybody really had to man and roughen up totally in order to get this stuff done. And here come some newbies who come in to barge in thinking that, hey, everything is paved. So there's a bit of pampering that happened naturally. So it's not something that is intended, but there is some pampering happening. So because now entrepreneurs is about, hey, go online, research what's the best offer around there, pick your biggest funding, try and make friends with the people, go to the conferences, just mingle with those managing directors, program managers, and community managers that are out there, and you will find your way in. And unfortunately, we don't accept this at Plastic Labs because we only look at the really top 10 startups that exist in country, while we are still being tech agnostic. But at a certain stage, we need to change that, and we need to drill deeper into like more segmentation into what we are looking for, because I think the pampering of the ecosystem is not also good in our favor.
Well, and it happens here too. I mean, the amount of companies, some that have very recognizable brands, who have valuations based on no value. They haven't provided any value. And if you look 5 or 10 years into the future, people can't figure out. I've talked to people within some of these companies. They can't figure out where they're headed in 5 or 10 years.
I mean,
because we need to.
The ecosystem is only 7 years old. I mean, you cannot expect exits and deal flows in the way that you would see an SFO. No way. That would be like that would be like a sweet dream. But no,
This is a collateral result of the single bottom line model. This is something that all of us in the global startup ecosystem need to understand. This is a harsh product of the single bottom line model. Building startups through a narrow scoped through a scope of defining value as a single bottom line is not cutting it anymore. And this is why and this is how it converted most so-called entrepreneurs and startup founders into drones that negotiate equity before actually building a product.
Right. Yeah.
So it's important for all of us who are actually professionals in the field to start challenging ourselves and what I like to call rethink what a corporation is.
Yeah.
But by rethinking a corporation, you need to start understanding the amount of the amount of opportunity that lies in building companies that cater to the double bottom line or the triple bottom line, because you cannot neglect profitability, but you cannot define value through profitability at the same time. You cannot define value through ROI. You cannot define problem solving through deal flow. You cannot. You need to start striking the balance between both. You need to start challenging the status quo by really identifying what needs to happen from within organizations that are supporting entrepreneurs in order to start speaking the right language to entrepreneurs. Because if you're speaking the language of funding all the time, if you're speaking the language of money to equity ratio, if you're speaking the language of competitive acceleration and funneling down only the most viable business ideas, you need to understand that your investment is going to be short term. So if you don't generate short term returns, you won't find the best value creating ideas. You will only invest in businesses that are derivative, the ones that copy the existing model.
Right, sure.
So the longevity of investment is highly dependent on seriously understanding the impact and the value that any startup can generate, because with value comes profit, and with profit comes impact, and they just keep basically working hand in hand.
So, final question. You talked about going to Sweden, looking at some other ecosystems to bring back to Egypt, to bring back to Cairo. Flipping that around a little bit, often we here in the United States, or many times, think that the world revolves around us, right? And that we're the only ones with the good ideas and everything, right?
No, you just have good movies. That's all.
Yeah, you have Hollywood.
Yeah. So what can we here in the U.S. learn from you? Learn from Egypt? Is it that creative chaos that we need more of that to unleash more of that? Is it,
I think there is a lot. I'm one of the people who has a background, who has a very strong American background in his education. My school was a hybrid between the Lebanese mindset, the American curriculum, and British and British discipline. It was a very weird combination, but essentially the curriculum was American. It prepares you to think like an American. It prepares you to perform like an American. So, in a country like Egypt, in a country like Egypt, there are a lot of similarities between Egyptians and Americans. America and the United States is deeply rooted in what I like to call hard work, opportunism, basically the underdog. Work hard, fight, and you will get to places. This is the land of opportunity. I believe that Egypt has a lot of similarities to the US as well. Egypt is a very resilient country. Egypt is a society based on struggle. We are a struggling society. Essentially, the richest people in Egypt, the most successful people in Egypt who have built their empires from the ground up, were very simple people, were people who come from very simple backgrounds and very isolated areas in Egypt. Our fathers, if I would say like myself and Mustafa's, come from simple backgrounds and they've built themselves from the ground up and they did not get the support that we have today. So there is a lot of similarity between the Egyptian culture and the American culture. We both have an excellent sense of humor as well. Both cultures are very flexible with their environments. They adapt very easily. Both cultures are very social cultures. They enjoy building relationships and they enjoy the idea of being associated to a group and nurture the relationships. And on top of that, I don't believe that the US needs to learn from us as much as that both cultures have a lot to cross-pollinate, have a lot to bring together. The significant difference between the US and Egypt, in my opinion, regarding our line of work or regarding the culture of the ecosystem is that the US has much more capital to spend, while Egypt has much less capital to spend. But we cannot replicate what happens in the US, and I believe that the US cannot cannot replicate what they can learn, what we do. So it's a matter of how can we combine this together and create something that's even better than the both of us, or mitigates what sucks about the both of us, because with cultures like the US and Egypt, there's a lot of shit that sucks. There's a lot of cultural aspects that suck, that are regressive, that really bring us backwards. But there are very few things that are very powerful, that are engraved, that are really instilled in our behavior, that make us successful.
Well, thank you guys for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you, Curt, for giving us the stage.
Yeah.
And letting us philosophize our way through.
Well, I really appreciate it. I appreciate you guys having me out there, coming on the podcast, and we'll have to do this again soon.
Of course.